Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait a couple minutes as we let everyone join the Zoom room. Hope everyone enjoyed the beautiful sunrise this morning. Driving into the Monona Terrace, it was just incredible. All right, 30 more seconds and I will start. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the Sustain Dane Summit. My name is Claire Olekshak. I'm the Executive Director of Sustain Dane. I'm excited to be here with you today, both in person and virtually. I would like to start today recognizing that we are on the traditional territory of the Ho-Chunk tribe. I acknowledge that the systemic inequity existing today stems directly from past crimes against the Ho-Chunk people. The Ho-Chunk tribe has lived here for over 12,000 years. I celebrate their incredible resilience and strength. Sustain Dane's vision is a thriving and inclusive community with a sustainable environment and economy we are proud to pass on to future generations. Our work each day, our mission is to inspire, connect, and support people to accelerate equity and sustainable actions for community well-being. We approach this with the lens of holistic sustainability, which is the intersection of environmental health, equity and social well-being, and a just economy. At the summit today, we have come together to share in the experience of learning and reflecting and gain new knowledge and connections that can lead and inspire this holistic change. And as our keynote, Kimberly Nicholas, writes, who we'll hear from in a moment, one of the statements is, we should maximize meaning and minimize carbon. And that's really stuck with me as the work of Sustain Dane. Thank you to our partners, members, and sponsors who make this summit possible and all of the programs, impact, and good work of Sustain Dane possible. It's a joy and an honor to work with each of you. Please take time to read the signage posters with partners, members, and sponsors information at the Monona Terrace and visit the exhibit booths. We also have provided an online version in the chat, and we will send this out in the post-program email with the recordings of the program. Let's support each other and support organizations that value sustainability. As our first hybrid summit, we're growing and adapting together. For those in person, there is a computer at the back of the room to type your questions into the chat, and those will be sent to the speakers. For those of you virtually, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat, and you can add your comments and questions in the chat as well. You can also join us on social media. 2021 has been many things, a roller coaster at times for me and potentially many of you as well. Through it all, I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to work with you as part of the Sustain Dane community. This has been a year of momentum, growth, a very impactful year. We surpassed 600 sustainability projects implemented by individuals and organizations as part of our initiatives over the past 10 years. You can sign up for our 2022 Accelerate Sustainability Workshop as one of those programs, a really great leadership opportunity for those of you looking to get involved and spearhead a project. In housing and energy, we have 100 affordable apartments that are improving energy efficiency to address housing resilience, equity, and climate change. Our new recycling program had 524 course participants who completed outreach projects that touched an additional 44,000 people. We also supported numerous partnerships in Madison schools with bilingual energy leaders, reducing vehicle miles traveled and increasing wellness through COVID recovery, and focusing on the climate, health, and equity connections. Sustain Dane is a catalyst of the ripple effect. Lastly, a huge recognition to our board, staff, and interns over this past year. What an incredible group. The Sustain Dane team brings energy, dedication, and effectiveness to this organization and to the community. On to the keynote. Welcome to our moderator, Raj Shukla, Midwest Director of Freshwater Policy at the Nature Conservancy, and our keynote presenter, Kimberly Nicholas, sustainability scientist, writer, speaker, and author of Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Claire, for the opportunity to talk today. My name is Raj Shukla, a resident of Madison of over 20 years and a believer in the power of people to solve our most pressing challenges. And I'm also a longtime fan of Sustain Dane, which has activated people, businesses, and communities to create a healthier, happier Madison region since the turn of the century now, 1999. So yay. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Kimberly Nicholas back to Madison, virtually at least. She is a sustainability scientist at Lund University, and she's the author of Under the Sky We Make, and you can see the cover of it behind her, How to Be Human in a Warming World. And the monthly climate newsletter, We Can Fix It. She's published over 50 articles on climate and sustainability in leading peer-reviewed journals, and her research has been featured in outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, USA Today, BuzzFeed, and now Sustain Dane's annual summit. We are thrilled to have you here, Kimberly. Welcome back. Tell us how you got back to Madison and the sort of journey that took you through writing this book and talking with us today.
Thank you so much, Raj, and thank you everyone at Sustain Dane for having me here. It is lovely to be back in Madison. I was there physically 2001 to 2003 when I did my master's in land resources at the Nelson Institute at the university. And I was studying prairie carbon cycling and prairie restoration out on the hills outside Madison. So originally I come from Sonoma in California. It's about an hour north of San Francisco. I have moved around in the US, but did undergrad and then my PhD at Stanford. There I was looking at the wine industry and how they're adapting and limits to adaptation for climate change for the California wine industry. And then in 2010, I got this job, so a faculty job here at the Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. So I've been here now 11 years in Sweden.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I'd be interested to know, and just reading this book, I think one of the first things that you communicate so well and that resonated so deeply with me was just how personal this discussion is for everyone. What was it that inspired you to work on sustainability as a student, and then progress on to really evangelizing around what we can all do to address some of the biggest sustainability challenges that we're dealing with?
I think originally my love for the outdoors and growing up in a beautiful place and spending a lot of time in nature was really inspirational for me. I love hiking in the mountains in California and spending time at the coast, at the beach with my family in the summers. So when I was in university and found out I could be a research assistant and get paid to hike around in the mountains, this seemed like a dream come true. Over time, I think my work has focused more and more on human systems and on how humans take care of nature and how we could do a better job of taking care of nature through agriculture, for example, because it just became clear to me that it didn't make sense to study nature in isolation from people. Humans are having such a big impact on the whole world, and really we have to, study people and nature together in order to find solutions that work for both.
Yeah. Well, you introduced the work with a story about a conversation you had with a friend. And the fears that that friend was grappling with. Talk a little bit about that and how that informed how you approached the rest of the book.
Sure. Well, this has definitely been a journey that I am on and am still on, where I think my scientific training prepared me really well for designing experiments and studies, gathering and analyzing data, writing it up, going through peer review. It really didn't prepare me to deal with the more personal and emotional side of what we now live in the climate emergency or the climate crisis. And that really, it's not the case anymore, which it maybe felt like to me when I was in Madison 20 years ago, that, oh, climate change is some kind of distant phenomenon that will happen sometime in the future to someone else, somewhere else. And it's really, in the last 5 years, become very clear that it's happening to me and to my family and to the people and places I love. My family was evacuated in the wildfires in California in 2017. I'm very thankful they stayed safe. For a few weeks, my parents didn't know if they would have a house to go back to. It turns out that they did, but many friends were not so lucky. And we know that those catastrophic wildfires in California and the West have been made twice as likely, and the area has more than doubled because of the contribution of burning fossil fuels, human-caused climate change. So it really feels like everything in my life I kind of see through climate-colored goggles nowadays. And I guess to come back to your question of addressing where the climate crisis intersects with people's daily lived experience is where I am trying to bring the conversation, because I think that's something that everyone can contribute to and everyone has something to say.
Yeah. And you frame the discussion very helpfully for me, and I think for a lot of the folks who are watching today, but you frame the discussion around the idea of an sort of an exploitation mindset versus a regenerative mindset. And I think we all have some sense of what that is, but I'd love to hear from you about what that means to you and how it sets the stage for what we can accomplish and how we can remake this world.
Sure. Well, I wanted to give, everyone is in their own unique circumstances. And I know we'll come back to this, but I think the most common question that I get is, what can I do? And we'll talk more about that, but people want a really personal answer. And I think, then we have to go into personalizing it to your skills and abilities and where you find yourself. And that's very important. But I think, I can't do that in a book for everyone. I'm working on an interactive guide now. But in the book, I wanted to give a set of principles, kind of teach a person to fish rather than just give you a fish. So the principle I came up with is to make this contrast between the exploitation mindset, which to me is the root cause of a lot of our problems, not only the climate problem, but many of the injustices that we have around the world today. And that rests on two faulty assumptions. First, the erroneous idea that some people are superior to other people. So imposing hierarchies instead of seeing everyone as an equally worthy human being. And second, imposing the idea that people are superior to nature, or that people should have dominion and be in that kind of power relationship to nature instead of working together with nature. So what I'm proposing to undo the exploitation mindset is this mindset of regeneration. And that centers on three principles: focusing on people and nature, the well-being of both people and nature, putting that at the heart of everything we do. Secondly, undoing harm and stopping harm at the source rather than trying to treat its symptoms. So getting to root causes and righting injustices. And third is building resilience. So increasing our ability to cope with and support each other and thrive even through change.
Yeah. I want to get back to some of what you got in there, but I want to key in on something that you mentioned there, and that's just this sort of intersectionality of the various ways that an exploitive mindset touches our lives. And it's not just on climate, it's on a whole range of issues. Talk to all of us a little bit about just environmental justice and the intersectionality of these issues, and how your thinking has evolved over time, and maybe how it's evolved while you were writing this book.
Sure. Yes, I do think there are some common causes for many injustices, including the climate crisis, in this exploitation mindset. And we know the research shows really clearly people who are marginalized historically and in vulnerable positions are more disproportionately harmed already today, by the impacts of climate change, and even more so stand to lose more in the future. And that's just fundamentally unfair. I mean, a safe and stable climate should be a human right. And those of us who have emitted more than our fair share, who have caused more than our fair share of climate pollution, certainly that applies to my home country, the US, and where I am now, Europe, have caused half of the climate pollution, the carbon pollution that's driving climate change today. For companies, I think we'll talk more about this, but there is disproportionate responsibility among a few companies that have really delayed and even sometimes led to misinformation or disinformation. And on the individual level, it's folks who have a high carbon footprint. And sometimes people misunderstand the importance of focusing on personal and individual action. It can be used as a smokescreen for companies to avoid responsibility, and there's no excuse for that. But it also can be used as a smokescreen for us to not do what we can where we are. And there actually is so much power in acting where we can. So I think for me, an important part of climate justice is recognizing these huge inequalities, and that there needs to be a floor that everybody reaches, that we need this sound basis of social well-being and services and equality and education and healthcare that every person has a right to. But we also need to rein in overconsumption, and in order to have enough to go around, basically. So I think I see a lot of my work for justice being in speaking to this group, of which I'm a member. If you earn more than $38,000 a year, you're among the 10% richest people on Earth, and in this group that causes half of household carbon pollution. So that's the group I'm a part of. That's the group I'm primarily writing and speaking to. And I think by making these arguments and hopefully planting some seeds and giving some ideas for ways of living differently, we actually are contributing to justice, because we create more space for others to have what they need.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a point that resonates with everybody who's watching this today. And I think a lot of us are trying to do our part, right? And then we see what happens at COP26, which I think many of the people watching today would view as falling far short of what we need to do. For me, that there's grief involved in that, in watching a group of people who are supposed to be our leaders falling short, when many of us feel like we're trying really hard to do our part, right? Talk a bit about like the stages of radical climate acceptance and that you talk about in your book, and like what, how readers of this book can navigate them and make sense of all of the different feelings that are coming up as we deal with this.
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right about COP26. It's not enough yet. It is a step in the right direction, but the final estimates were that the pledges from Glasgow would lead to about 2.5 degrees of warming, and the Paris Agreement is to hold warming well below 2 degrees and pursue 1.5. And we know that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is the difference between life and death for many places around the world, countries, whole ecosystems, ways of life. So that really is critical. So it was a big step forward, but definitely not enough. So you're totally right about that. And I get the grief, because it does feel really depressing when leaders don't step up. And I mean, many people like you and many others are working as hard as you can, and it hasn't quite gotten there yet. So I think I see these 5 stages as a way to face reality, sometimes some tough facts, be able to tolerate difficult circumstances, and still find ways to move forward with purpose and kindness and support each other in doing that. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, talk to us about what are the 5 stages, and is it the same 5 stages of grief that we all that we imagine when we imagine, or is there another way to look at it?
So the 5 stages of radical climate acceptance are ignorance, avoidance, doom, all the feels, and purpose. Ignorance, I don't think applies to anyone in this group, but we all have to learn about climate change somewhere. Avoidance, I've spent a lot of time in, because sometimes it can be more uncomfortable it feels too uncomfortable to face some difficult truths. But at some point, it becomes more uncomfortable to avoid than to actually face the truths. Doom, I want to emphasize, is a stage. It's not the end. So I think a feeling of overwhelm, many people say they feel helpless, that they don't feel that their actions matter in the climate crisis, or hopeless, that they don't think anyone can do anything. And those things are not the truth. But to cope with that feeling, you need to actually face and acknowledge and make space for it and find ways of tolerating feelings like grief and anger and all the climate feels that come along with this crazy circumstance that we're in now, that we're these critical generation of people who have really the fate of the world in our hands. And we've not, our leaders until now haven't done what's necessary to protect us and future generations. And there's a lot going on there. So I think, avoiding feelings doesn't work. We have to find ways to go through them. And one use of feelings I've found is that they can help flag for us what we really care about. If you feel grief, it's because something you love is being harmed or lost. If you feel anger, it's because something unfair, unjust is happening. So those feelings are valid, and they can really help you tune into what is it about this that resonates for me, and where can I be useful in trying to make things better.
Yeah. One of the viewers sent in a question that I want to kind of bring up, and it hits me in my heart because it involves changing one of the areas that I avoid action and avoid doing something on is meat consumption, is changing my diet. And I think COP26 itself and the research that preceded it and all of that has really focused on agriculture and meat consumption in particular as one of the drivers of what we're dealing with. And yet we have had a really challenging time, certainly in the United States, in addressing it, even naming it. Why do you think that is? And as you think about the stages of grief and navigating those, and how do you think we can get beyond that?
Well, great question. And as you know, I have a family history in agriculture. So my grandfather bred the Nicholas broad-breasted white turkey, which is the turkey. If you eat turkey, it's probably the turkey you're eating for Thanksgiving. It's the main supermarket turkey in the US and around the world. And it is basically an example of the kind of industrialized agricultural model that has caused a lot of our problems. So I think the reason is we have really focused on the wrong things, on maximizing food production and ignoring any cost. And of course, we need to feed the world. That's not an option. But there are ways to do it that aren't only focused on absolutely squeezing the very last drop out of production at the cost of polluting air, polluting water, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. So we know that a healthy and sustainable diet, we know that a plant-based diet is much better for climate than a meat-based diet. We know that a healthy and sustainable diet can include some meat and animal products, but at a much lower level than the average American diet now. So if you look at the Eat Lancet report, their recommendations are about 2 hamburgers per month would be the max for beef consumption. Mm-hmm. And then a couple servings of fish and chicken and egg every week, a glass of milk or a piece of cheese every day. That fits in a healthy and sustainable budget. And that is a food system that we can have, but it does take some changes. And where we can affect that most directly is through our dietary choices. Then we get to the policy level, which is very similar for fossil fuels, that there are entrenched interests that like the status quo and want to keep it how it is. And there needs to be both top down and bottom up pressure to make changes happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your answer and throughout the book, there's so much that's talked about. Everything is framed as a choice. We can make different choices, and that's all good and fine. But we have a luxury of having choices. There are people that are right now going through very real threats right here and now that are taking away choices in life. And it kind of touches on a concept that you talk about, just climate privilege, what that means. And just elaborate a little bit on what climate privilege is and how we can use our privilege in a more productive way.
Yeah, I think this has also been part of my journey of kind of looking in the mirror and recognizing my own privilege. That, I mean, of course, there are communities who have faced existential threats before, who still continue to face existential threats before climate change. So, you know, I think there's a lot of conversations happening. Well, certainly I'm reading a book right now that talks about this, you know, saying, well, it's an example of white privilege that I didn't have to think about an existential threat before climate change. So I think I'm very aware with that. And I guess when you are in a group with privilege, meaning education and money and historical structural advantages and others, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to use that privilege for good and both pass the mic, share the platform, raise voices of other people, but also talk to the group that I am a part of, which is, you know, for example, college educated friends, people I went to grad school with as well, who now are in positions of privilege and power and can do so much. I mean, we just published a paper last month on these 5 roles for high impact climate action that basically the US and European middle class and up, so this top 10% globally, who, you know, don't think of themselves maybe as, oh, I'm you know, a global elite, but basically if you have a college education, if you make more than $38,000 a year, if you have a stable job, you are actually a global elite. And if you live in the US, still a democracy, last time I checked, not something to take for granted, but, you know, there's still a lot of opportunity to work politically too. And so there's so many, this group has so much power, and I think they have no idea how little they're using their existing power.
So let's get back to that sort of idea of us managing grief. So honestly, what you said just now, talking about us organizing politically to change this, it's something that I have believed in my entire life. And I feel like many of us here in the States are seeing what we thought of as a democracy, well, it's still a democracy, as seeing that slip away in a variety of different ways. And that compounds the idea of grief, that compounds the grief inside of us. You talk about, you know, how you wish you had answered friends who are expressing some of that grief. Talk to us a little bit about it. What does it mean to like confront that, grab hold of it, and move past it?
Yeah, well, maybe I can contrast 2 examples. So in the book, I write about a friend who, over dinner, kind of out of the blue, said to me, "The Great Barrier Reef is dying." And she just said this very matter-of-factly. She's Australian. And I didn't know what to say. And I felt like I was being asked to pass judgment or give some kind of comment as a scientist. And I'm not a coral expert. So part of me was thinking, what's the last paper I read about coral reefs? And, oh yeah, I mean, there's a 97% chance of it. You know, I was kind of looking for loopholes of like, oh, but, you know, maybe this population will be okay or whatever. I really got bogged down in the weeds. Yeah. And what I wish I had said, and what I'm trying to learn how to do, is not have to have all the answers, especially when someone's expressing a feeling. I mean, she wasn't asking a question about, you know, coral reef survivorship at a certain temperature. She was opening a dialogue, and I think I missed that opportunity, which I regret. So I think instead, if I had asked questions, heard more from her about, you know, has she ever been to the Great Barrier Reef? How does she think about it as part of her identity as an Australian? What, you know, understanding and sitting with where she was at. And I think where I did a much better job of that was when one of my best friends was diagnosed with and ultimately died of lung cancer. And there, it was just so clear that that wasn't a scientific situation. I mean, that was a human situation. And being able to spend time with him and his wife, 2 of my best friends, and just exist in that moment and have conversations, sometimes very serious and existential, sometimes silly and, you know, about ridiculous bad TV. But, you know, that was more what was called for, and being able to be present in that moment and go through it together. I think I have a lot to learn about that. And I think those skills we really need to cultivate now to support each other in the climate crisis.
Yeah, and it kind of touches on so much of the discussion around climate change, and what we do just feels inaccessible to so many because it is so in the weeds. It is so technical, much of what we're talking about, and the solutions are so technical. So I don't know, how have you kind of worked within yourself or helped others to make it more accessible? Is it as simple as like have some stories in your head that talk about this on a human, like what do you do, or what advice would you give to so many of us who fall into the same pattern?
Well, a piece of advice that has really stuck with me and I have found to be true is people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So I try to start talks and conversations with I mean, if it's like a one-on-one, that's a different story. But if I'm giving a presentation, I try to start with a personal story and talk about where I'm from and why I love wine and something that I actually am authentically passionate about. Because I think that basically the secret superpower to talking about climate is to talk about what you personally love and care about. And everyone can do that authentically. And I mean, even better if, you love fly fishing and you talk to a group of fly fisher people, of course you have that in common. But I mean, it's not the case that you don't only have to talk to that group. I mean, people can recognize, oh, you nerd out about whatever it is, this kind of movie or this kind of music or this hobby or whatever. And even if I don't exactly share that same thing, we have that in common. We have some passion in common. And of course, it's also about listening and talking to people and understanding what they care about, what their values are, and finding that common bridge.
Yeah. Well, I'm finding in the Q&A that's coming up that a lot of people care about food, which we touched on. And I guess, and in some, I just get your thoughts a little bit on how our government sort of treats food. Our kids during COVID many of them are receiving lunches at school now, and it's a wonderful development, but much of that food isn't great for the environment. It isn't great for our kids. I mean, do you feel government needs to have a better policy for the food system as a whole with schools? How is it treated in Sweden? What can we learn here in the United States?
One thing that's interesting, there was a study recently that found if every country just followed their existing health-based diet recommendations, you could have a massive climate savings as well. So there's really a strong connection between health and climate and food in particular, where eating less red meat, more plant-based, having about half of your plate covered with fruits and vegetables at every meal, that is just a win-win for health and the environment. In Sweden, kids do have school lunches provided, which I know parents love. And my mom says that the worst part of being a parent was preparing school lunches. And she put me in charge of that as early as possible. Right. So I'm very much, especially all parents have been through continuing in the pandemic, like, yes, I think it sounds great if schools provide lunches, but of course we want them to be healthy and sustainable lunches. So I do hear good things about the school lunches here. I think they are like pretty focused on health and sustainability in the school lunches. And of course, children are the future. I mean, it can't be oversaid, but I mean, people develop eating habits young that they have throughout their lives. So that is a really important opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, you talk about, personal actions we can take to change our diets and all of that kind of stuff. Obviously, it's intertwined with the systemic kinds of challenges too. Another systemic challenge that it's a hot topic of conversation right here in Madison is transportation and how we have to change our system of transportation if we are going to survive and thrive in the next few decades. Talk about what that means and how we as a society need to change the way we move from where we live to where we work to everywhere in between.
Well, a sustainable transport system would have a lot fewer cars. And I think that can be hard to imagine in the US, where I always owned a car when I lived in the US. It's certainly easier to imagine here, where I don't own a car, I don't use a car, and I don't need one. But it is possible, even in the US, to really reduce dependency on cars. And that would be such a win, both for social and income inequality, because it's low-income folks who are most hurt by not having good public transit, actually, for the environment and for cities. I mean, we give so much of our space in cities to cars. There's a wonderful cartoon, I don't know if you've seen it, but it visualizes cities. Basically, it shows a city where there's like canyons where the streets are, and then there's these narrow little rickety, pieces of wood that represent bridges going between sidewalks. And it's basically saying all of this space, and it's like parents and kids and elderly folks and people in wheelchairs, and everyone who lives in the city is kind of marginalized and pushed off to the side because all of the space is taken by cars. So basically, reducing the need for cars as much as possible is the place to start. And that's a win for health, and both physical and mental health, being more active in moving around. And that's a win for climate. But it takes, that's a planning question of having 15-minute cities, for example, is really taking off, where you have everything you need from work to school to groceries to culture to parks within a 15-minute walk or bike ride of where you live. And those are, Madison might fit that definition, actually, but there's a lot of different choices. You're working on it, yeah. But then you just have to think about things differently.
Yeah. Well, you have the benefit of having lived in California, having spent some time here in Madison, now living in Sweden. Talk about, there's an evolution in mindset that needs to happen in some parts of the world versus others. Talk about the differences in those places and what we can learn from how people in Sweden view the world and their place in it.
One thing that is interesting, maybe this isn't exactly what you asked, but the first thing that occurred to me is that I feel like everyone, wherever they are, feels like, oh, we're so small and we're so marginal and we don't really make a difference. I had that feeling a little bit in Madison of like, oh, here we are, like we're this like People's Republic of Madison, this wonderful sort of self-contained bubble, and but we don't feel so connected to the larger world. And I feel that as well in Sweden. You hear all the time people saying, oh, it doesn't matter what Sweden does in, climate or X, Y, and Z. We're such a small country, nobody cares. So I think everyone has this mistaken idea that like somewhere else is the center of power. And of course, power differentials are real, but I think being able to use the power we have is really big. I guess a big difference in Sweden, we're still living in a world of contradictions where things just don't make sense because we have pretty good climate laws, but we're not in line with them yet. So Sweden has said we will reduce our climate pollution 85% by 2045. So they're aiming to be net zero by then, which could be better, but is, not bad, but we're not on track to do that. So, every country except for the Gambia is the one country that actually has a 1.5 degree compatible climate plan, which, they've hardly emitted anything to begin with. So, they're not the burden of solving the climate crisis should not rest on the Gambia's shoulders. But Sweden has not yet really implemented the changes that we need to make our own goals happen, and the politicians haven't delivered their promises yet.
Yeah. And that is certainly a feeling or something that's common here as well, and something that's common around the world. And obviously, we're going to have to get over that. You talked about transportation and the need for transportation systems to change. I think you'll probably say the same for housing as well. And here in Madison, it's a big issue, as it is everywhere else. Talk a little bit about where housing fits into this and how we may want to approach housing here in Madison to be better stewards of the planet, but also be better to our people, but make living here less costly and healthier.
Yeah, and that is so important because one of the one of the most high impact climate actions you can take is to live close to work and school and where you need to be, so that you don't need a car, so that you can walk or bike or take a bus or whatever to where you need to go. But of course, if that's not affordable and that's not available, then you don't have that option. I think housing in general, one interesting difference I would say between housing and cars. So everyone needs a house, everyone needs a place to live. Not everyone needs a car. And in general, the costs for renovating or retrofitting housing to make it climate smart, so insulating and investing in existing, like retrofitting existing housing stock to be climate smart, is unfortunately kind of expensive. And therefore, I think should be done at a governmental level where there are, so it shouldn't be on the individual house by house to do that. I mean, we need building standards and regulations basically, and training for contractors, and that really needs to be a system level and made sure that it will be affordable so that it doesn't, because there's a real risk for injustice. So making, you know, regressive policies that hurt the poor in being climate smart. Right. Cars are actually the opposite. So there was a study last year that said more than 90% of people with cars, there's a small group of people who are dependent on cars for their livelihoods and who don't have extra income, and policies can and should be designed not to penalize them. But most people with cars, it really is a luxury, and it should be taxed higher, and it should be more expensive to drive to finance things like necessities like safe and comfortable and climate friendly housing that everybody needs.
Right. Do you think air travel fits into the same kind of place? There's a small group of people who fly the most, and they would say that it's central to their livelihood. You know, I have family members who are taking a trip to Hawaii. I don't think that is central to their livelihood, but it is what they're doing right now after COVID and not being able to see each other for a long time. Talk a bit about where flight fits into this, especially in this time where, like, God, we are so eager to just reconnect with the world that we've been sequestered from.
Yeah, well, you're definitely right. Flight is a luxury. Most people on Earth have never been on a plane. Of course, leaving the pandemic out, because flying behavior was, of course, different then. But even, you know, the year before the pandemic, most Americans actually didn't fly. So flying is globally unusual. It's only about 1% of the global population that causes half of the pollution from flying. Yeah. So there's a big justice issue there. And I think there's an increasing focus on limiting frequent flying, because it is, I think, quite unfair that this small group causes so much climate pollution. I myself am a former frequent flyer. So in 2010, I took 15 round trip flights. So I was definitely in this 1% of, you know, really bad climate polluters. I was inspired by a friend in 2012. I decided to stop flying within Europe. And that's been, you know, a journey where I've reduced my flying to 1 flight per year back to North America to see family and friends. So that's still higher than it should be from a carbon budget perspective, but it is a 95% reduction. And my husband and I are taking sailing lessons. So we have a goal to make a flight-free trip to North America. He's from Canada. So we're working on it. So I do think you can have adventure and, you know, a lot of the benefits of travel. If saying no flying doesn't mean no travel or no adventure. I think where it's the most tricky is what George Monbiot calls love miles. So seeing family and friends. I mean, it is really possible to replace, like, oh, I want to go somewhere beautiful. I want to have a relaxing time on a beach. You know, those are things you can do close to home. But seeing someone who lives in Hawaii and you live in Madison, if that's your family member, that is a really tricky flight to reduce.
Yeah, absolutely. I struggle with it myself, and it's like a professional necessity in some ways just to sort of get work done. But yes, yeah, we all have to make progress there. So you talked a little bit already on some of the personal changes that you've written, about. You talked just about transportation. What was the transition like? Like, was it hard to get over, like, I'm not flying anymore, I'm not doing the conference circuit thing that was probably a big part of your life? What was that transition like for you?
I think I spent about a year in analysis paralysis, where I was trying to get a spreadsheet to tell me what my values were. It doesn't really work, I've learned.
Is that avoidance, Kimberly?
I think so. That was stage 2. That was stage
right.
2. Then I had a few beers with Charlie in a bar in Vienna and was like, okay, I can face this fact here. I mean, but I did really have to come to a like moment there, because we were in this climate conference with a bunch of other scientists and hearing all these really dire reports and analyses of how serious the impacts of climate change already were and would be. And it just felt like I'm a doctor at a conference of doctors. We're talking about how dangerous it is to smoke and telling our patients not to smoke cigarettes, and we're puffing on cigarettes. And I just couldn't do it anymore. So actually the hardest part was making the decision. Once I kind of saw this pathway of, okay, I don't have to say I'll never fly again, because I don't want to make that commitment. I mean, I have actually taken 2 flights from Sweden back to the US, and my dad has been in the hospital. So I don't want to rule out those emergencies or a visit to family. But there's a lot I can do. And I don't have to have, I shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and daring to start. So I guess it was actually, I mean, I think it was figuring out how to travel by train. And then it became actually really fun. And it was an excuse to see new places and people along the way, to make the journey a part of the trip. My husband and I decided to have a wedding by train, basically. So we flew to Canada and had a wedding ceremony with just our immediate family. And then we took almost a month to go through North America by train, through 3 Canadian provinces, 16 US states. We had a party in Madison. So lovely friends around the country hosted us for a small gathering, usually at their house or a park or whatever. So then we really got quality time with the people we loved and had a lot of adventure along the way. So I think that we found a lot of upsides that I didn't imagine before I started.
Well, maybe that's a really helpful way to think about this. And maybe that can be a way that we can frame an exercise that we'd love for all the participants of this summit to take part in. Many of you at the event today at Monona Terrace have a little card like this, which is a blurry blue box on your screen, but you have a little card, My Climate Commitment. And this is your chance to choose an area where you are going to make a change in the coming days. So Sustain Dane and the Dane County Office of Energy and Climate Change have identified 5 categories listed on the climate commitment card. It's on your table right now. And they build off Kimberly's book, some of the areas that you identified, Kimberly, that we need to take action on. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, but this is a starting point for everybody. So I'd encourage all of you at the event right now to pick up one of those cards and to pick one that you are going to focus on. For those in person, take the card on the table, write your name and email and circle your category, raise your card once done, or stand up to show that you're done. At the break, after the keynote, you're gonna add your card to the climate commitment poster. And Kimberly and I are eager to see a picture of this poster at the end of the session. We'll have time as well as at lunch to talk more about these selections. And for those virtually, we're going to put up a Zoom poll and invite you to elaborate on your selection in the chat. Just a little bit, it's up right now. These are the categories: transportation, energy, ripple effect, investments, food, or another one. Pick another to add to the list. A little bit about ripple effect. So spreading your impact by teaching others and moving toward collective action. Don't use that as a cop-out though. Like, don't just say, I'm going to talk about it. Choose something meaningful there. We're a community, we care deeply about the future of this planet. So think about where you feel inspiration and a category, and what category will bring you joy to focus on. I think Kimberly's words I'm taking really to heart. How can you make this fun for yourself? How can you maybe open up a door in your life? So research shows that making a commitment publicly makes it more likely to be successful. So join me in sharing with others what you do. So Kimberly, I talked a little bit about food and my love of hamburgers maybe should focus into this. I had one this week. I will have only one more during the remainder of this month. And we're heading into Thanksgiving. So I might actually, there will be no hamburgers next week. So perfect. That's one.
There's no limit on potatoes. You can have as much potatoes as you want.
Right. Potatoes and Brussels sprouts. Perfect. My kids might have some words about that, but that's okay. So I'm going to pick food. This is an area where I really want to make progress on. I want to eat less red meat. That is an area that many of the attendees here are also focusing on. Food. Transportation is a big one. Energy. And we're lucky to have a few options here in Madison, to whether it's community solar or others that we can get involved with. Investments, which is something that we haven't talked a lot about. Kimberly, I don't know if you have some thoughts to share on how we as individuals or institutions might want to change investment practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is one of these 5 roles where we have this disproportionate opportunity. It's a leverage point for change, and I think we could use it much better. So what I have done with investments, I broke up with my mega bank. I used to have B of A when I lived in the US, and here I had a similar large bank. And if you look at the report, Banking on the Climate Crisis, you'll probably see the name of your bank there if you have a major household bank and your credit card company. Because unbelievably, even still today, banks are still funding and investing in expanding and producing more fossil fuels when we need to be doing exactly the opposite, winding down fossil fuel production, having a just transition for workers to clean energy. So closing your bank account and telling your bank why, shifting to a credit union is a really good option. I have a letter in my newsletter. I share the letter that I sent to B of A of why I was breaking up with them. So sharing, that's kind of both investment and then ripple effect, like doing high impact climate actions and then letting people know about them can really have an impact. At the
Dear John letter for banks. Love it.
It was. I never heard back, but I did have like a good face-to-face conversation with the person who worked there actually. So that, I mean, it starts to add up. At the institutional level, it was big news last month that Harvard University finally divested from fossil fuels after a 10-year campaign by students. And that divestment movement has really had a big impact and continues to have a big impact. And now investors are talking about, I mean, recognizing that it's a financial, not just a risk to life on Earth, you know, it might also harm our bottom line. Maybe we should care about it. So, I mean, people are starting to recognize that it's not a good investment to continue to be putting money in fossil fuels. So I think both at the personal level, if you have any personal investments or through your pension, you can check Fossil Free Funds is a website where you can enter the ticker code and see the carbon footprint of your investments. And I did that and was horrified and switched. I mean, I'm not a financial advisor, but what I personally am invested in is something called Etho Climate Leaders. So it's a diversified fund where they've gone through a pretty rigorous screening process of across all sectors except fossil fuels, who are the climate leaders in those sectors. So who in food, who in materials, who in consumer goods is actually following the Paris Agreement already and putting the right policies in place, both to financially reward them now and with the assumption that those are the companies that are actually going to survive and thrive in the 21st century, and that will be a good financial return.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of tools, and I didn't jot them down, but we are going to follow up with you, Kimberly, and figure out what those tools are. And also the study you referenced earlier, it was a Lancet food study or something like that. That I know some of our viewers are really interested in digging deeper into. So we will follow up with Kimberly and get those resources out to attendees later on. And I may have just added more work to the wonderful team at Sustain Dane. So sorry about that.
Well, they're all in the book too. They're in the TLDR, the Too Long Didn't Read. So
oh my gosh, perfect. Too. So definitely buy this book if you don't get a copy today at the event. You know, I would love to hear more, and I know a lot of us would love to hear more about your time in Madison and how it shaped you. It's definitely a place that seems to inspire lots of people to do more by our world. And I would love to just hear about your time here, what you thought of it and how it shaped you.
Sure. Two stories that stick out for me. One, I lived on Jennifer Street when I lived there in two different houses, but I really loved the Isthmus. And I couldn't believe we moved in. And if like that day or the next day, some people showed up on our door with a pie. I was like, this really happens. It's not just in the movies. Like, this is the Midwest. So I love the neighborliness of Madison and the fact that you actually do get to know your neighbors. The dear friends who hosted my wedding in 2018 are friends from my time in Madison that we've kept in touch with. And I think that is actually such a wonderful quality about a place to live, and also really important for, this reaching actually resilience, helping each other, and being able to lift others up when we're down, having a community that makes things fun and that we can actually connect with and get things done and enjoy together. So I love the neighborliness. I think this is very random, but Madison was like very ahead of its time. The Nelson Institute had a picnic on Picnic Point, I remember, and everyone had to bring their own plates and silverware and stuff. And I remember thinking that was so weird, but now it seems like, oh, they were really advanced. Like, yeah, of course we shouldn't have, one-time throwaway stuff. But it felt like, oh, this is a bit awkward. We have these like random Tupperwares and stuff, but they were really ahead of their time. So I think and I've kept in touch with the friends from grad school. We meet every Christmas. Last year was on Zoom. We usually go to a conference together, either virtually or in person, where we have a night of getting together. So I think the relationships I made in Madison are probably the strongest thing I took with me.
Yeah. There's a funny flip side to that neighborliness, though. It sometimes it encourages people to kind of keep things the same. We want a community where someone can come next door and give us a pie, and we can't bring a high rise near us to house more people because it's too many pies, first of all, and so like how do we get over, I guess, or what are some thoughts that you have on embracing change as a way to maybe be good neighbors to each other?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I guess something that's helped me there is reading climate fiction and also playing games. And some of them are role-playing climate games or even board games, but I think the playful spirit is really helpful. And I love reading fiction where you can just imagine the world being different. And I guess the reason I thought of that in answer to your question is, of course, the only constant is change, and everything is always changing all the time. And it's really worth, working to keep what's good about being good neighbors. Yeah. But change happens. And I mean, I guess it's kind of realizing staying exactly the same forever and ever is just not an option for life on Earth. Humans and life doesn't work that way. Yeah. So what are some exciting and positive and inspiring and engaging ways that we could imagine change and working towards those? Because it's just, I think people can be change averse, but you don't think about, well, change could be for the better as well.
Yeah. As I get older, I am acutely aware of that impulse to just protect what I have. Don't change, don't protect what I have. But it conflicts with this other urge in me, which is sort of like, okay, I'm seeing the world spiral in a variety of different directions. And I'm realizing that it's people my age and older that are like blocking change from happening. So here's another thing that I want to do here, another personal commitment on that ripple effect one. I've kind of made it a point to sort of, I want to empower my kids and their peers and, my nephews as much as I can. And the exercise in my head is kind of like, shut up, listen to them, and agree with them almost immediately. Agree with them and help their voice, I guess, help elevate their voice. Which brings us to this other sort of thought, like, how do we engage and empower that next generation, the folks who are going to be living with the consequences of our inaction at some point? What are your thoughts on that, and how we best support that next generation of leaders?
I mean, I think step one is listening. And when I have had the chance to listen to young people, it is just so incredibly powerful. And we see so much leadership from 12, 10-year-old, many girls, young women who are really leading a lot of the climate movement. And it's so humbling, and also just a kick in the pants of, okay, if they can do it, we can really do a lot more. So I think, I mean, having face-to-face, you know, where possible COVID-wise, but having heart-to-heart conversations is really important, and listening and creating space for young people's voices, and not in a tokenistic way, not in checking a box, and but really having decision-making power and a seat at the table. And there's some innovations happening to make this happen. One is that I think it was Wales and a few other countries now have a minister for future generations. So that person represents the interests of future generations explicitly at the negotiating table for government level decisions. That's one way. I mean, the COP, thinking of the climate summit that just wrapped up in last week, youth are an explicit constituency to the climate agreement. And you know, there was a lot of discontent, I think rightfully so, from the youth, that their voices weren't being heard. So I think ways of actually empowering people. And I think there's a group that Bill McKibben is co-founding called Third Act, which is for people age 60 and over to be in solidarity with young people and be a part of the movement for climate justice and making a fossil-free world. And I think that's so powerful, because I think many older people are really wrestling with this legacy question. And, you know, what kind of world have I contributed to or helped create or prevented from, you know, being created? And how can I actually leave, you know, I really want to leave a better world for my kids and grandkids, or other people's kids and grandkids too. So I think having that intergenerational solidarity is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So were there, you know, what surprised you when you were writing this book? Did anything, you know, you're an expert on so many of the issues that are touched on in this book. Were there areas that you were surprised either by what you learned or how you felt?
One thing that surprised me is that it feels like that, and I use that word feels too, that it seems that the middle of the book where I write about feelings, it has resonated a lot with people. And it felt like that felt vulnerable for me in writing the book, because I hadn't really written about feelings before. I was much more comfortable with the facts and the actions. I mean, my book is sort of structured as facts, feelings, and actions. And those, I think, are the three powers that we need to effectively tackle the climate crisis. And that's also how my newsletter is structured. But I think the feelings was maybe the most uncharted territory for me at the beginning. So that was pretty cathartic for me, I think, to actually put some ideas down on paper and reflect on my feelings. And I mean, others have said that they can relate to it or find it helpful. So that's really gratifying if it's serving to help some others.
Yeah. Another thing that, you know, I thought about, and it was the start of our meeting, there was a land acknowledgement, you know, recognizing that this event is taking place on stolen land and Ho-Chunk land. The conflict between sort of a Western way of and an exploitive way of looking at society and traditional way of looking at things that Indigenous people have been living and modeling for a very, very long time. What, you know, how have, in Sweden, are there Indigenous peoples that you have studied, looked at, worked with to enact some of the changes that you want to see? And like, how can we better share power or step back from power so that folks who have been doing it right maybe take a bigger role?
Well, this is an area where I definitely don't have all the answers. I mean, the native people of Sweden are called the Sami. They live in the northern part of Sweden, and I'm in the southern part. So when I looked up to do a land acknowledgement, the maps there wasn't a native indigenous group here before the Nordic people who settled here in the southern part of Sweden itself. But of course, there still are indigenous people in Sweden, and there are the conflicts which we see, played out all over the world over resources and access and environmental justice issues around siting and land use and so on. So I think there are some of the same issues. My own research, the only insight I have is that we did a study of kind of major synthesis science over the last decade, and we found that the focus, there is, at least in science now, a real understanding and acknowledgement that traditional ecological knowledge is important and needs to be better studied, and it was mentioned much more frequently in the more recent documents. So we see that trend actually reflected in science, which I think is very positive. Mm-hmm. But in terms of real practical solutions, I mean, I think I'm still learning and listening. I really appreciated the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a plant ecologist and writes from a native perspective on, I think a really big takeaway for me is this idea of relationships and reciprocity. So the idea that people are in a relationship with nature and with each other, and that the idea of nature giving gifts rather than providing services, in being much more relational instead of transactional, and thinking about, okay, what responsibilities or duties do we have to reciprocate and take care of nature, or to honor those gifts and use them wisely and not take them for granted. So I know there's a big land back movement, and I've read a few articles about that, for example, but I don't have concrete answers for exactly what to do there.
Yeah. And yes. So what do there are lots of messages that people can take away from this book. And I know that just in reading it, there were a whole bunch of different threads that I'm taking away. If there was one or a few takeaways that you want people to walk away with, what are they?
I think one really key message is that you really matter. What you do really matters. And it matters both because it affects others around you, and because if you are in this group that I keep talking about, and I saw some discussion in the chat, it feels easy maybe to forget this position in the middle of the US, but there's so much global privilege in just living in the US. And unfortunately, historically, the US has been such a terrible force in delaying climate action that even ordinary average Americans have so much power to make big changes, and those ripple effects do really spread. And so, yeah, I really want people to feel like what you do really matters. And the thing I'm working on now is I really want people to focus 2 hours a week on climate action. And I would prefer within these 5 areas that I named, but I think the ones you have in the poll are good as well. So like focusing systematically on where can I have an impact, and where do I want to focus? Do I start at home with my own personal consumption? Do I want to start at work and other organizations, as an investor, as a role model, as a citizen? Mm-hmm. And really focusing on what we know from research are the high impact levers there. I'm thinking 20 minutes a day. Americans spend 10 hours a day consuming media on screens. So you probably have 20 minutes to spare some time, and you could take Sundays off. But it would just be really transformative, because last year, less than 6% of people donated money to an environmental organization, like your wonderful one of Sustain Dane or others, and less than 1% volunteered. So the baseline is just so low. I mean, even a small change like that would make a huge difference.
It's an easy win, everybody.
Yeah.
Turn your phone off. So what gives you, what would you say to people who are just entering this climate discussion? Folks who maybe don't come to it with the same background as you and many of the people that are at this event. How do we broaden this group of people? And what would you say to those folks who are new to this and are coming into it like, oh my God, we're in a terrible spot? How would you address that?
I would say welcome and thank you for being here, and we need you. And we need everybody's skills and talents. So it's not that you need to now study up for years and become an expert on, the minutia of some detail of the mid-Atlantic circulation or something. But what we need from you is to offer your skills and talents in a way that can serve this transformation that is underway and needs to be sped up. So, I mean, that can be, basically, you need to do a little self-assessment of, what am I good at? What do I like doing and think is fun? And how can I use those things to serve the climate movement? So, I mean, it could be baking cookies for people. It could be hosting events. It could be using artistic skills or advertising, commercial communication skills. It could be keeping the spreadsheets and the books for a small nonprofit. I mean, there's just so much work to do, and everyone can really contribute. So I think it's starting where you are and using what you have and looking around and learning what's already happening where I am, which, I mean, I think this group sounds already very well connected, and I see recommendations in the chat for other groups to support. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah. How do you flip that around, I guess? Like, you talked about encouraging people to give what they can to be a part of this. What's the flip side? What can someone gain by being a part of this movement? Like, what's the climate pie that you give to somebody that gets them invested in this movement?
What's in it for me? I mean, a livable planet. B, B, overcoming major injustices. But yeah, I think it just feels better. Yeah. I mean, it feels better to live in line with your values, and it's more fun, and you have more satisfying relationships. I mean, I think it's just like night and day for me to compare my experience with my husband, who I married in 2018, where we really share those values, with previous relationships that I was in where it just didn't work, and it was so much work, and it was so at odds. And it just, when things are in sync, it feels so much better. You just have more energy and fun and enjoyment of everything. So I guess it really feels meaningful. I mean, it doesn't always feel easy to be doing this work, but I never question that it matters. And I think everybody really wants to do something useful. I mean, to be of use and of service and make the world a slightly better place in whatever modest way we each can, and not get over, I think key then is just not getting overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, but seeing where we can make a contribution and make the contribution that we can.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll close on two questions that I think are kind of intertwined, but sort of, what does a sustainable future look like to you? What does society look like when all is said and done? And maybe tied to that, like, what gives you hope in this discussion? Leave all of us with the good feelings that drive your work and what you've contributed to the discussion.
I mean, I really dream of a time where I can read the headlines and feel a sense of relief and joy. And that would just be such a different feeling than the headlines now about things going in the wrong direction, losing beautiful places, people being endangered by worsening climate disasters. I mean, we basically could rewrite all of that and make things so much better. And I mean, maybe then media would go out of business or have to really flip around their business model, because that's not the kind of news that sells. But, imagine reading like, oh, biodiversity increases for the 10th year in a row. Climate, it's actually starting to stabilize, and in fact, eventually over some decades cool down and get back to, turn down the heat and release the pressure and actually be getting better. So I would love to read that. And I guess I think in those terms would be really meaningful to me. Yeah. And then what keeps me going? Well, I think it's not, I get the feeling that sometimes people want an assurance that this is definitely going to work and we are definitely going to fix it and it's all good. And I can't give you that, because there's really high stakes and we don't know how it's going to turn out. But that is just the way things work. And I think it is so meaningful and important and fun and rewarding to be part of Team Climate, who are doing all that we can in our different ways around the world to actually create the kind of world that we want and to live in and leave behind. So I think seeing people act and seeing the creativity and passion and interest and diversity of the movement and of people acting does really inspire me. So it's not a, I like the idea that it's courage and not hope. It's not a that we need. It's not a guarantee of an outcome, because then actually, why would you bother if we know everything's going to be fine? Everything is really up for grabs right now, and this decade is so critical. So, you know, you could play an important role in the most important moment of human history.
Yeah.
You should do it.
None of us, you know, at the end of the day, none of us chose to be here, but we can all choose where we're going, a little bit at least. So I'm so grateful. Kimberly, we are also grateful for you sharing your work with us and sharing your insights over the last couple of hours. I thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to Sustain Dane for making these kinds of conversations possible for over 20 years now. And grateful to you, Claire, for giving me the chance to meet Kimberly and talk today.
What an incredible first session. Thank you, guys. We have a 15-minute break coming up, so please continue to reflect and discuss. If you have completed your climate commitment cards, you can add them to the poster because Raj and Kimberly want a really filled up picture. And for those of you that are virtual, we will be able to continue getting you registered and get your feedback as well. So thank you for this amazing session. Our next session will be at 10 o'clock, the local leaders panel, which you are not going to want to miss. And after that, we'll have an extended lunch and networking opportunity. So thank you all. This afternoon was then going to have our celebration of organizations and individuals that are leading sustainability projects and the Live Forward Awards. Wonderful. Have a wonderful rest of your day, Raj and Kimberly. Bye-bye. See you all at 10 o'clock.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.